Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about sex, gender, and sexuality. To approach biological sex, gender, and sexuality, we're going to take a biopsychosocial approach, which means we need to be considering biological factors such as genitalia, chromosomes, gonads, estrogen, testosterone, arousal, biological processes. We also need to be thinking about the structure of the brain. Is there a difference between a male brain and a female brain? Does the brain have a gender? Does the brain have a sex? Then we also got to be looking at cognitions. How are thoughts associated with sex, gender, and sexuality? And then we're going to be looking at the social context. We're going to be asking, how does the socialization process affect your brain structure? How does the socialization process affect the way you think, your cognitions? So again, biopsychosocial. It's the only way to really approach psychology because we have to understand what's going on in your biological systems. What's happening when your hormones are being released by your endocrine system? How is that, associated with your motivation toward sexual encounters, for example? If we don't understand the biology of sex, we can't understand sexuality. So what gets kind of confusing is the back and forth use of sex and sexuality. So again, we need a couple of working definitions. So sex, we're going to refer to as biological sex. Okay, so that's chromosomes, genitalia, gonads. Gender is the perception of what sex you think you are. So sex is based upon biological traits. Gender is perception. And then sexuality, again, is a biopsychosocial process involving physiological arousal and attraction, and then the social context regarding social norms and what's acceptable sexual practices within society. Okay, so biopsychosocial approach. We're going to talk about biological sex, gender, and sexuality. So again, the definitions, just to get clear. Sex is biological status, okay? Chromosomes, genitalia, gonads, anatomy. And gender is the perception of what sex you are. Now, a couple of questions you have to ask here is how many sexes are there? Okay, so there are more sexes than just male and female. There's another category called intersex, but even intersex can then be subdivided in all kinds of unique ways. So again, people are born with two vaginas. People are born with a vagina and a penis. People are born with ovaries, a vagina, but lots of testosterone. And so, again, the balance of all of these factors are associated with your identity as male or female, your biology functioning as male or female, or something in between. So, again, how many sexes are there is a question that I am still personally asking in my own quest because it turns out that sex, biological sex, comes in many, many forms and fashions as a result of evolutionary adaptations. It's just built into our genetics, for example. Gender is another category that is infinite. There is an infinite number of genders. Gender is simply how do you categorize yourself? And you can even go further and say getting rid of the categories altogether and no longer categorizing yourself. So again, sex, biological sex, the three G's, chromosomes, gonads, genitalia, and gender, perception of what sex you are. But again, that's just you categorizing yourself. And the gingerbread person picture is a perfect example of this. We all range somewhere between masculine and feminine, male and female. Okay? So again, when you start thinking about sex, gender, sexuality, you got to start thinking about range theories, spectrum theories, continuum theories, that we all kind of exist within this genetic potential range. Now, are there differences between men and women was the initial question that I wanted to ask when I started my own PhD. Under undergraduate and for my master's, I really looked at race and I asked, is there a difference between people that are black or white? And I was able to say pretty clearly, no, not all black people share common genes and not all white people share common genes and no one's actually black or white. So I could figure out how to end racism by just saying, hey guys, we're not different in the ways you think you are, so stop, segregating yourself, stop calling yourself by these races, and racism will go away. But when I got to men and women and I asked the same question, are men and women different? I got stopped pretty hard in my tracks because the first person I asked was a medical doctor, and the medical doctor said, "Where do I start?" And she just started listing all the differences between men and women. And it got me thinking. Okay, so men and women's bodies, there are some obvious differences. Okay, relating to testosterone and estrogen, to during puberty and development, there's different changes. There's menopause for women, there's the fact that women can have babies, there's body size, fat content. Okay, so there's some differences. You can look at the brain between a man and a woman, and it might look different, but then you got to ask the question, why does the brain look different? So, what's interesting about the brain and when it comes to sex differences in the brain is that a big debate exists in psychology whether or not a female's brain looks different than a male's brain and it's structured differently. And they've had some slight hints like gray matter areas. Girls have more emotionally developed centers than boys do. Boys have more visual spatial skills in those areas lighting up than girls do. But you have to ask the question, how much of differences between men and women is based upon physiological factors like hormones? For example, with this slide, males tend to be more aggressive, but that's as a result of having more testosterone. Okay, and so as a girl has more testosterone, does the girl become more aggressive? And there are boys that have less testosterone that are more aggressive. And there's some suggestions that men are more independent, women are more interdependent because women rely on social groups and that network more than men for various evolutionary psychological reasons. Survival, needing the group, if you're pregnant, you have other women around to help you, things along those lines. Because again, does a woman really need a man or does she not have a group of women? So that's a really fun evolutionary psychological argument for why, just because a man could hunt while a woman is pregnant, for example, is that really the real reason that, blah, 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 stereotypes exist? And one of my favorite arguments against it is actually women are very communal. Okay, so they don't necessarily need a man. Even if a person's out hunting for months at a time, they have each other. They don't really need a man. And so it's a really good pro women's rights movement argument that I'm a fan of. But again, are these differences in being more communal for girls and being more aggressive for boys? Are these biological or are these socialized? And so you have to find that balance between the brain differences between men and women. And you have to ask how much of those differences due to the socialization process. Because here's what happens. If I take a German brain and a Chinese brain, and I take two, both of them are men, and I have them do the same math problem, their brains are going to look a little bit different. Why? Because of culture. They were socialized to think differently, therefore it structured their brain differently. Therefore, when they do a problem for someone in China and someone else in Germany does the problem, different parts of their brain might light up, not exactly alike, because they've been taught to think in unique ways. Now, what happens is if you take like a man who works and a woman who stays home and you put their brain and you superimpose their brains on top of each other, there's going to be some differences there. However, if you take a woman CEO and a male CEO, you put the two people in the same job, all of a sudden their brain starts to look very similar. So in psychology, the go-to answer generally is this. Yes, there are differences between men and women. There are differences when it comes to hormone levels, a little bit of brain structure, size, all of these factors. But the influence of that on behavior is minimal. So, what we're kind of coming to the conclusion is most of the differences between men and women is not necessarily due to our biological sex, but the socialization process and how we were raised. So, again, it's very important to understand the social context to understand the behavior of males and females. And again, the behavior of males and females, that's the study of that's psychology. But then understanding the social context and how that influences us and how identifying with groups and the groups influence us, that's sociology. So again, we need to be looking at this biopsychosocial approach, to be asking questions like, are men and women actually different? Because if you can't understand biology, you're not going to understand differences between men and women. If you can't understand brain structure and the way that cognition is affected by the social context, you're not going to understand differences between men and women. If we don't understand the systems and structures and power and privilege and oppression that exist in society, we're not going to understand the differences between men and women. So again, sex differences in the brain, there are some subtle differences. However, there's no striking differences on behavior. There's no reason to suggest that just because men and women like have some subtle differences in brain structure, etc., or like cognition or which areas light up at certain times, that doesn't have this huge effect on behavior. The biggest effect that we have on behavior is the social context. Okay? So again, there are some basic biological differences between male and female bodies. And again, this PowerPoint kind of goes over all of that. Males have XY chromosomes, females have XX. I mean, again, the differences are on the genetic level. Okay. Boys, puberty is stimulated with testosterone, girls with female hormones. Uh, Puberty, you have, can be a little bit, they're different for boys and girls, is a different process. Different organs are produced, therefore you have different hormones telling different organs to be produced, etc. So again, there are all these biological differences. And again, so we can go on and on about the biological differences, but in the end, how much of an effect do these biological differences have on behavior? And there's some really good questions there. Like, are girls more drawn toward nurturing things because that's in their DNA? And are boys more drawn to like holding baseball bats because that's in our DNA? But the other thing is, there's a little bit of evidence to suggest that's there too, that we have a biological affinity towards certain objects, that we're attracted to certain things based upon our biology. So again, it's very important to understand these biological differences, and especially when it comes to asking how many sexes there are, as this slide covers the idea of intersex. And again, I used to think there were two. Then now it's required that you have at least an other category on any study. So male, female, and other. And then I started asking, well, how many people fall into the other category? Because that's what we do with race too. We have black, white, Native American, Native Alaskan, Native Hawaiian, we have Asian, and then other. And so every other race, including Hispanic, Latino, Chicano, Mexican, all the blends, all fall into this other category. Again, I'm not a fan of racial categories, and you guys will hear me talking about that a little bit later, but still, we got to ask the question of how many sexes are there? And so, again, the potential for genetic blending is infinite. And one of my favorite questions about intersex, okay, not being male, not being female, something else, is that an evolutionary adaptation or is it a defect? Because again, what if one virus wiped out all the women in the world? Well, some intersex people can still reproduce. So even if we lost all the women, because there's intersex people, humanity could live on. And so again, is intersex a defect or an evolutionary adaptation? Again, it's just different ways of looking at things. But the real question is how many sexes actually are there? And what we're finding is this comes in multiple combinations. Some of them result in fertility, but some of them result in sterility. So again, many questions. When we look at the social context, we're going to be asking questions like how does the socialization process operate? How are people socialized into gender roles, these expectations and behavior that everyone expects of us? And when we're in the womb, we're being socialized into masculine or feminine. Our parents are picking out our colors for us, they're picking out our clothes for us, they're dressing us, they're checking our behavior. They're making sure our behavior matches the expectations. Girls' toy aisles are all pink, boys' toy aisles are all blue. What's up with that? And then again, how do the stereotypes about men and women, what's the stereotype effects of that? Okay, so you hear some stereotypes like women are too emotional. And in my sociology classes, we do surveys and we study gender roles. And when we ask, why or why not would you vote for a woman president, one of the most popular themes is I wouldn't vote for a woman president because they're too emotional. But when we get to intelligence, what we're going to see is your emotions are actually a tool. And that maybe one reason that girls get more college degrees than boys in modern times is because they use their emotions as a tool, which is allowing their brain to grow neural pathways for those emotion linked centers, which is actually improving your thoughts, which is actually making you smarter in general. So the stereotypes about being too emotional are actually dumbing down entire populations of people. We should encourage people to embrace their emotions and use their emotions as a tool because, again, they run from our limbic center, our limbic system in the middle of our brain out to the outer cortex, whereupon we reflect upon our emotions because they're tools. So again, gender roles. Boys are socialized traditionally to be providers, to be breadwinners, and girls are socialized to be nurturers and to be homemakers and take care of children. Now, is that based upon biology? Do biologically do girls want to take care of their kids more than boys do? And then do boys just want to be out hunting and never see our families because we're always out hunting all the time? Or is that stuff that we're socialized into? So again, how much of these roles we take, these behaviors of masculinity and femininity and all the expectations that are attached to those categories, how much of that is biological? Like I'm a man, I want to do this, and how much of it is I'm supposed to because everyone tells me this is what I'm supposed to do. So again, you got to find that balance between how much of your behavior and your behavior as man or female or intersex is associated with your genetic self, your genetic personality, and how much of it's influenced by the social context. Okay, our gender identity is an incredibly complex variable. In order to understand gender identity, again, it's a biopsychosocial process. So, how do you feel? What's your natural self? Who do you feel masculine, feminine, somewhere in between? Okay, how much of your gender identity is you just trying to make sense of reality and decide which category you fit into? And how much of your gender identity has been socialized by other people? So, you got to think like, do girls wear dresses because they want to wear dresses, or do girls socialize to wear dresses? And then if a girl wears a tux to prom, what do they assume about that person? And again, you kind of see this balance between stereotypes and gender identity. So our gender identity all ranges somewhere between masculine and feminine. And then along that continuum between masculine and feminine, that's where people lie. It would be hard pressed to say anyone is exclusively feminine or exclusively masculine because, again, we all blend somewhere in between. But our gender identity is an infinite category, but it is influenced by our biological sex, our genetics, our DNA, okay? Because that's built into us. So much of our behavior, the way we function, the way our brains operate, is built into our chromosomes. Your attraction to other people is a physiological response. Okay. And so your attraction to other people might also influence your gender identity. But again, how we learn about our gender identity, this comes through social interaction. By interacting with other people, we learn what sex we are, and then we learn to model and imitate the behavior of that sex. And so when we're modeling and imitating behavior, we're actually constructing our identity in the social context. And so as I act like my father and my father act like his father before them, we are then reproducing these gender roles, reproducing these gendered personalities from generation to generation. What's really interesting is maybe if you stop thinking of yourself as male or female or enter any of those gender identities, maybe then you might be more free to experience all kinds of different genders. Like a boy can maybe cry if we stop being limited by these masculine gender roles that I'm not supposed to cry. Okay, so our gender identity is our personal self, your own personal decision of what category or no category that you are. Okay? Social learning theory is the idea of what I'm talking about. We learn about gender, we learn about behavior, what's the social norms, what's the expectations through interaction with other people. We also learn through conditioning, reinforcement, and then again, the overarching socialization process. But we also learn through observation and modeling and imitation. Okay? Androgyny is generally where I think most people lie. We all kind of have this blend. Okay, I take care of kids, I cook, I clean, I work, I do all of those things. I play both male role and female role. I never just play an exclusively male role, and I don't really know anyone that else that does. I really think we kind of all kind of blend. Now, there are some interesting arguments that as equity in society increases, for example, masculinity and femininity also both increase, and males and females tend to be even more different than each other, which is a really radical idea. So maybe gender identity is a natural development of all humans, but again, so much of our gender identity is learned by interacting with other people as we learn to use the language and categorize our thoughts and to make sense of what status we have and which groups we belong to. Okay, gender identity is very different than our sexual orientation, though. Again, gender identity is simply a perception of, your status, what group you belong to, who you are as a person. It's part of identity and personality development, okay? Much larger process. And then again, it's a biopsychosocial process because who you are, your identity, is influenced by your genes. That's why you end up a little bit like your parents, even if you don't want to. But so much of who you are is based upon your personal experiences in the social context, and then your cognitions, your interpretations, your perceptions of what you've experienced. And our sexual orientation is a attraction and arousal to a specific sex or multiple sexes. So again, sex hormones for boys, testosterone, girls, estrogen, okay, they are associated with our development. At certain times in our lives, such as puberty, testosterone is released and then estrogen is released, which then, instigates the development of all of our sexual genitalia and things along those lines. Again, these surge in puberty. Um, when you want sex, these hormones are released. For example, your body does this for you. A lot of it is unconscious. Again, it's the endocrine system communicating. It's your body communicating with your brain and telling you what you want, telling your body to develop. So again, you don't tell your body to develop. Your genes are activated, which then send a signal to your brain to tell your brain to release these neurotransmitters, which then cause the development. And again, it's a very biological process, which is what, if you guys get deep into developmental psychology, go deep into studying these kinds of things. But I'm not going to bore you with it too much in intro class. But again, there's a lot of biology here because how much of your behavior, your desire for food, your desire to go get sex, your desire for comfort and warmth and attachment, how much of this is simply influenced by your hormones and these unconscious processes? How much of you calling your friend and finding someone to hook up with is, your body just driving you and motivating you? And how much of it's your conscious decisions? So again, it's that balance of the two-track mind of your body is moving you, whether or not you want it or not. And then you do have some control over that with your consciousness, but again, your unconscious is pretty powerful. Okay. So again, how much are your hormones driving you? How much of your body's driving you? And then how much of this is associated with your gender identity? And how much of this is again associated with your sexual orientation? The book talks about the sexual response cycle, the process the body goes through, excitement, plateau, orgasm, resolution, and the refractory period. Your book talks about sexual dysfunctions, such as erectile disorder, female orgasmic desire disorder, paraphilias, being into objects, inappropriate fantasies, pedophilia, things along those lines, impairment of arousal or functioning, just like not feeling it. But then sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is what sex or multiple sexes or no sex are you attracted to or aroused by? Okay. So your sexual orientation is, what are you drawn to? And what are you are drawn to is very much a biological, psychological, and sociological process. Like what you're attracted to, you feel it. Like when you are into somebody and you want to ask somebody on a date and you start to like them and you're thinking about kissing that person. So much of this is a biological response. You can feel that. Now, a lot of that is because of your thinking, but your thinking then causes you to feel it. So not only do you feel it because of the release of hormones talking to your brain, but your interpretations of situations, interpretations of arousal is then also causing even more of a physiological response. So again, your body's talking to your brain and your brain's talking to your body, and that's what happens with sexual orientation. So again, are your genetics associated with your orientation? Absolutely. Are your genetics associated with your identifying as gay or identifying as bisexual or identifying as homosexual or lesbian or any of the other categories which are very infinite also? Absolutely. Now, we need some social norms in society because if we don't have social norms, sexuality and human animal basic behavior tends to come out. And again, even with social controls like the police, 1 in 4 women are raped. Okay, children are being molested. Okay, so humans are quite capable of things that lie outside of social norms. And again, this is why we need some laws and some regulation on our sexual drives and on our sexual orientation to make sure humans don't have sex with animals, because they do. To make sure humans don't have sex with inappropriately with children, and they do. Okay, to make sure they're not raping women and children. And again, that's the whole dark side of it all. And I'm not going to get into that too much. But I say that only because not all sexuality should be socially controlled, like being identifying as gay, for example. Identifying as gay is perfectly normal. It doesn't cause harm to anyone. The only one that is harmed from being gay is the person that identifies gay because they're harmed by the stigma imposed upon them by society, by social norms, and social control. Until 1973, being gay was considered a psychological disorder. Okay, they would institutionalize you for this, just for saying I am gay out loud. They would disorder you, strap you with a label, a psychological disorder, and throw you in an institution. So again, we need to be challenging a lot of social norms. And it's good that we're challenging social norms such as, same-sex marriage and women going to work and African Americans and white people being allowed to marry without fear of lynching and death. But some social norms are good, such as those that protect our children, such as those that protect, from sexual violence, things along those lines. So, again, sexual orientation is very broad. It exists along a continuum, but what's most important is it's a biopsychosocial process. Your sexual orientation, what you're attracted to, who you decide to be with and marry and have relationships with, and all these things are highly influenced by your genes. They're also influenced by, again, your brain structure and your thinking. How do your interpretations of situations, your interpretations of what you're attracted to and what you like. And then also the social context. Because, again, I wouldn't be able to say I am gay 50 years ago and still be safe walking down a street. There's a reason the closet exists, and it's really sad that the closet ever had to exist. But the reason the closet did exist is because of these kinds of factors, because of prejudice and discrimination and fear of violence and the real violence that did exist. So again, we need to challenge some social norms, but we need to also realize that sexuality exists along a continuum. Alexander the Great was gay, okay? Homosexuality has been normal so many times and then labeled as deviant other times, then back to normal other times, and it's a complete swing. But again, it's part of our genetics. No one is totally straight and no one is totally gay. We all have this kind of blend, this continuum, okay? All right. So again, our bodies, sexuality, the way we think, male and female differences, so much of this is based upon evolution. Okay? So in order to understand how we got to where we are, how did our brain grow in these three phases, we have to understand millennia of human evolution. And again, that's why it's important to understand biology, Darwinist theory, and things like that, because they can account for a lot of the reasons that we are the way we are. Like, why are men taller in general? Why is that the case? Why do women have less testosterone? What's the purpose of that? And so again, we should be asking, what's the evolutionary purpose to our bodies developing the way they are? Behavior the way it is, our attraction levels the way they are. Okay, so we need to be asking that. I like evolutionary psychology a lot, and I apply it all the time because I have to ask the questions of why is it that way? Okay, so when it comes to relationships, again, it's the nature versus nurture, guys. How much of you is, hooking up with the person you're with because you're just by your biology, you're attracted to them physically, and how much of that is, what you were told, you wanted out of life, someone who had money and someone who has a car. Who cares about good looks if you have money and cars, right? So again, just some of the stereotypical cliches. People are capable of all kinds of relationships, though. Monogamy, non-monogamous relationships, and we all have that kind of a blend. There are some really good discussions about brain rewards and which types of relationships have the most effects. And it turns out that there is something to monogamous relationships with brain rewards long term, but there's also something to the brain rewards with short term interactions. So our bodies are built, both in our brains, both for long term monogamous relationships and also short term kinds of relationships. And I kind of see that in modern times as we've kind of opened up the barriers to what's acceptable and what's not acceptable is that you're finding that people are engaging in multiple types of relationships and they each have their own forms of brain rewards. We all have attachment needs, okay? So we all have these needs for to be held and to be hugged and talked to, along with sexual needs and food and things along those lines. But we often get in relationships to fulfill attachment needs, which is why we have friends and we call people on the telephone. At first, you have your primary caregivers that are your attachment figures. Then, when you become, a little bit older, 7, 8, teenage years, going into high school, early college, your attachment need figures become your friends and your social group. And then when you get into more serious relationships, then those attachment needs tend to kind of go toward the significant other that you're in a relationship with. So again, the idea of relationships and human bonding, there's a lot of brain reward systems built into it. So, for example, when you hook up with somebody, your oxytocin is released in your brain, which makes you feel close to them. That's why after like a sexual encounter, you feel that sense of bonding and closeness because that's our body motivating us to go seek out that. Again, the reward system is an evolutionary adaptation. So we have reward systems where we release dopamine and oxytocin, things along that, neurotransmitters. Our brains release neurotransmitters to give us these rewards after we do what we want it to, after we do what our body wants us to do. It's built into us, okay? In attachment needs, there's also brain rewards for that, okay? Thank you so much. Again, when you're thinking about sex, gender, and sexuality, again, it's a big continuum. And you're asking questions like, why are people slightly different? Are men and women different? Are people of different sexual orientations different? Are all of us just a big blend of everything? Are people actually male and female? How much of our sex, our biological sex, influences our personality and our behavior and the way we interact with other people? So again, ton of big questions. This is just a quick introduction to sex and gender, the psychology of sex and gender, and then how does sex and gender and sexuality influence your brain? Okay? Thank you so much.